Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from contained fury. Layla al-Khoury held the sealed parchment with the royal seal between her cobalt blue-stained fingers, feeling the weight of every unread word, the scent of amber and sandalwood emanating from the expensive paper. Around her, the small workshop in Al-Sahara seemed to suffocate under the midday sun that pierced through the slits of the worn wooden windows. The silence was dense, broken only by the held breath of her Aunt Amira, who watched from the doorway with eyes that had seen too much. Layla closed her eyes for an instant, feeling the sweat run down her neck, and then tore the seal with a dry movement. Her dark irises scanned the lines in perfect calligraphy. A proposal. No, a decree, disguised as an invitation. The Sheikh Tariq al-Hamad wanted her in his palace. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you are joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The day had begun like any other in that scorching spring. Layla had woken before dawn, when the sky still held. The last memory of the stars and the air brought a deceptive freshness from the desert. Her hands already knew the way, preparing the paints, grinding the mineral pigments with precise, rhythmic movements her grandmother had taught her when she was still a girl with disheveled braids and scraped knees. The art of zellige ran in her veins like the blood of generations of artisans who had brought life to the mosques and palaces throughout the Arabian Peninsula. Every piece she created told a story, intertwined sacred geometry with the soul of the desert, captured light in ways that seemed impossible. Al-Sahara was a small, dusty city, anchored in time like a forgotten ship in a dry port. Its narrow streets snaked between adobe and limestone houses, where the echo of voices mingled with the bleating of goats and the distant call of the muezzin. There, far from the crystal towers and skyscrapers that tore the horizon in Dura al-Fajr, life followed the ancestral rhythm of the seasons and prayers. Layla had grown up there, amidst the smell of spices from the souk and the rough touch of sand between her bare toes. She knew every alley, every face, every secret whispered on suffocatingly hot afternoons. Her workshop occupied a low building in the heart of the artisan quarter, where the sound of hammers against metal and the creak of potters' wheels composed a familiar symphony. The inner walls were lined with her works in progress, mosaics in different stages of completion that shimmered with shades of turquoise, sapphire, jade, and amber. There she spent hours, days, weeks, lost in the creative trance that connected her to something greater than herself. Her fingers danced over the tiles as if playing an invisible instrument, creating patterns that seemed to breathe, pulsed, with a life of their own. It was her Aunt Amira who first noticed the change. A woman with a back bowed by time, but eyes still sharp as razors, she read the signs the desert sent, interpreted the silences laden with meaning. There had been something in the air in those last weeks, a tension that made the dogs howl at night and the elders murmur in their meetings. The caravans of merchants who always brought precious pigments from beyond the mountains began to dwindle. First, it was a 3-day delay, then a week, then 2. The merchants, when they finally arrived, averted their gaze when speaking with Layla, as if carrying an invisible weight. In the souk, where she was once greeted with smiles and effusive greetings, Layla began to notice subtle but undeniable changes. The spice vendors lowered their voices when she approached. Old Hakim, who always saved the best lapis lazuli blocks for her, suddenly claimed his reserves were depleted. The women who used to order smaller pieces for their homes began to politely decline, inventing excuses that convinced no one. It was as if a shadow had stretched over her life, invisible but inescapable. Amira had tried to warn her. On a crescent moon night, sitting in the small inner courtyard where a stubborn lemon tree insisted on bearing fruit despite the brutal heat, the old woman had held her niece's hands in her own, dry and marked by time. Her eyes shone with concern and a knowledge that transcended words. She spoke of power, of men who did not accept being contradicted, of how the desert had a long memory and infinite patience, but could also be relentless. Layla listened in silence, her jaw tense, her eyes fixed on the stars that twinkled above, them like silent witnesses to all the injustices of the world. But she would not bend, not now, not ever. Her art was not simply a profession or a hobby. It was her voice, her identity, her way of existing in the world. Each piece she created carried a piece of her soul, a truth that could not be bought or sold, only offered freely. The idea of becoming another beautiful ornament in a golden palace, of having her creative hands trapped in silk cages and empty promises, filled her with a visceral revolt that burned stronger than the desert sun. The parchment was still in her hands when she heard the footsteps, heavy, measured, accompanied by the soft jingle of jewelry or coins. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The palace messenger, a tall man in an impeccable tunic and white turban, stopped at the doorway. His face was a mask of professionalism, but there was something in his eyes, a mixture of curiosity and respect that surprised him. He had already delivered dozens of similar proposals to other women, and all had accepted with tears of joy and gratitude. This one would be different. Layla folded the parchment with deliberate movements, her fingers leaving blue marks on the cream paper. She stood up, her spine straight, shoulders back, chin raised with a dignity that seemed much greater than her modest stature. She walked to the messenger, each step sounding like a declaration. The man waited, perhaps for a question, a request for clarification, signs of nervousness or excitement. What he received was something completely different. No. The word came out clear, firm, without hesitation, a syllable that contained universes of meaning. Layla handed the parchment back to the messenger, her eyes meeting his without blinking. There was no anger in her voice, only an absolute certainty, a refusal so complete that it left no room for negotiation or doubt. The messenger blinked, confused, as if she had spoken an unknown language. He tried to repeat the advantages of the proposal, the Sheikh's generosity, the honor that was being offered, but Layla merely shook her head, a small but definitive movement. The silence that followed seemed to fill the entire workshop. Amira, still in the doorway, closed her eyes and murmured an ancient prayer. The messenger, not knowing what to do, accepted the parchment back and walked away, his steps now less sure, carrying with him a message he could barely believe he would have to deliver. A woman had refused the Sheikh Tariq al-Hamad. It was unprecedented. It was impossible. It was done. When he disappeared down the dusty street, swallowed by the heat and the dazzling light, Layla went back inside the workshop. Her hands, which had trembled with fury, now trembled with something different. Not regret, but awareness. She knew what she had done. She knew the consequences that would come, but looking at the unfinished mosaics that surrounded her, at the vibrant colors that seemed to dance even in the gloom, she knew she had made the only possible choice. Her freedom was priceless, and her soul was not for sale. That night, as the desert stretched infinite under a blanket of stars, Layla worked late, her fingers moving over the tiles with an almost desperate intensity. Each piece fitted was an affirmation. Each pattern completed a declaration of independence. The soft sound of glaze against ceramic echoed in the silence, a mantra that calmed and strengthened her. Outside, the night wind blew between the dunes, carrying secrets and promises, threats and possibilities. And in Dura al-Fajr, many kilometers away, in a palace of marble and gold where fountains sang and fragrant gardens hid shadows, a man held a crumpled parchment between his fingers, his onyx eyes fixed on the word that had been conveyed to him. No. For the first time in his life, Tariq al-Hamad faced something his power could not conquer, And that realization burned him from within with an intensity that all the gold in the world could not extinguish. The Emerald Palace rose against the sky like a crystallized mirage, its pointed towers reflecting the setting, sun's light in shades of amber and crimson. In the inner gardens, where centuries-old date palms offered generous shade and the murmur of fountains composed a constant melody, Tariq al-Hamad walked with steps that did not match the calm of the environment. His broad shoulders were tense under the white silk tunic embroidered with gold, and his hands, accustomed to holding power firmly, clenched and unclenched in a nervous rhythm he himself did not recognize. His vizier, Rashid ibn Khalid, a man with a grey beard and penetrating eyes that had witnessed 3 generations of rulers, watched from afar with an expression that mixed concern and curiosity. He had known Tariq since he was an impulsive boy running through the palace corridors, and never in all those years had he seen his lord so visibly disturbed. Not by political crises, not by threats from rival factions, but by a simple word uttered by a woman he had never even met personally. Layla's refusal echoed in Tariq's thoughts like an unwanted mantra. He had offered everything any woman could desire: wealth beyond imagination, status, protection, a life of comfort in one of the most magnificent palaces on the peninsula. And she had said no, not like someone politely refusing, but like someone asserting an inalienable right. The simplicity of that negative contained a force that completely disarmed him. Tariq stopped before an ornate fountain where water spouted from a marble sculpture representing a falcon in flight. His reflection on the rippling surface showed a 35-year-old man, angular features marked by the sun and the heritage of an ancient lineage, dark eyes that many said were capable of seeing through lies and subterfuges. But at that moment, looking at himself, all he saw was the vulnerability of someone who, for the first time, wanted something he could not simply take or buy. He thought of his father, the late Sheikh Faisal, a man with a firm fist and an even harder heart, who had governed Dura al-Fajr, transforming it from a modest emirate into a regional power. Faisal had never known the word no and had raised his son in his image, relentless, determined, convinced that a leader's will was as natural and inevitable as the sunrise. Tariq had learned these lessons well, perhaps too well. The empire he had inherited was vast and prosperous. The oil wells gushed wealth, trade relations, extended across continents, and his name was pronounced with respect and sometimes fear in distant capitals. But as he walked through the fragrant gardens of his palace, Tariq realized something disturbing. He had built an empire of things, but not of true connections. The women who passed through his life desired him for what he represented, not for who he was. And he, in turn, had never really cared about that distinction. Until now. Layla al-Khoury represented something radically different. He had not seen her face beyond the vague descriptions of the merchants who frequented Al-Sahara and a single blurred photograph his messenger had brought, but he had seen her art. The Zeliger panel that first captured his attention in the discreet gallery of the souk was a masterpiece that transcended mere technical beauty. There was soul in those pieces, a contained passion in the geometric patterns that seemed to tell stories without words. Each tile was placed with an almost religious precision, but it was the totality that stole the breath. An arabesque of colors and shapes that captured the essence of the desert at dusk, that magical moment when the sky bleeds in shades of purple and gold. And now, knowing her refusal, Tariq saw even more in that work. He saw the independence that refused to be tamed, the integrity that could not be corrupted, the silent strength that was more powerful than any army. Layla did not need him. She did not need his gold, his palace, his name. She had something he had forgotten existed: true freedom, the ability to say no without fear of the consequences. But Tariq was his father's son, and if he had learned anything in the political courts and commercial negotiations that shaped his life, it was that everything and everyone had a price. Perhaps not in money, but in something. He just needed to find out what Layla valued more than her independence. And then, with the arrogance of one who had never known real defeat, he began to devise his plan. Rashid approached cautiously, his sandals whispering against the polished stones of the path. His voice, when he spoke, had the careful tone of someone treading on unstable ground. "My lord," he said, measuring each word, "perhaps it is time to consider that not all battles must be fought. There are other women of talent and beauty who would be honored by your attention." Tariq turned so abruptly that the vizier involuntarily took a step back. The Sheikh's eyes shone with an intensity that reminded Rashid uncomfortably of old Faisal's explosive temper. But when Tariq spoke, his voice was controlled, cold as the desert night. "Do you think this is about beauty, Rashid? Or about talent? This is about respect. No woman in Dura al-Fajr would dare refuse what I offered. She needs to learn that there are consequences for insolence." Rashid lowered his eyes, but not before Tariq caught a glimpse of something in his expression. Disapproval? Disappointment? The vizier had served 3 generations with unquestioning loyalty, but had also maintained a moral integrity that sometimes conflicted with the orders he received. Tariq knew this facet of his advisor and, in moments of clarity, even respected it. But this was not a moment of clarity. "I want the caravans to Al-Sahara to be delayed," Tariq said, his voice taking on a tone of command that admitted no questioning. Nothing illegal, nothing obvious. Just delays at checkpoints, longer inspections, unexpected administrative fees. And I want our merchants to understand that doing business with Layla Al-Khoury's workshop may not be in their interest. "My lord," Rashid tried, his voice laden with concern, "this will affect the entire community of Al-Sahara, not just the artisan. These are simple people who depend on trade to survive. Then they must convince their stubborn artisan to see reason," Tariq replied, turning to look at the fountain again. "Sometimes collective pressure is more effective than direct force." Rashid hesitated, the weight of decades of experience pressing against the loyalty he owed his lord. He thought of his own daughter Yasmin, a young woman who studied medicine at foreign universities and who had inherited from her mother an independent and questioning spirit. What would Yasmin think of a father who implemented such orders? But he also knew the limits of his influence. Tariq was the Sheikh, and when he made a decision, he rarely went back on it. "It will be done, my lord," Rashid murmured, bowing his head in a formal reverence. But he added with a courage that surprised even himself, "I only hope you are prepared for the consequences of creating a martyr." The words hung in the fragrant garden air like a premonition. Tariq did not respond, but something in his expression changed, a shadow of doubt briefly crossing his features before being pushed back by the layers of pride and determination that had been built over a lifetime. That night, as the palace slept under a sky dotted with stars, Tariq stayed awake. In his private chambers, the walls were adorned with precious tapestries and the furniture were works of art in themselves, but everything seemed empty and meaningless. He held a small piece of zeligay he had bought from the gallery, a single tile with a pattern of intertwined stars in shades of blue and silver. His fingers traced the lines with a gentleness that contrasted with the orders he had given hours earlier. For a fleeting moment, Tariq wondered if there was another way. If, instead of forcing Layla to come to him, he could simply let her be. But the idea was so alien to his nature, so contrary to everything he knew and was, that he pushed it away almost immediately. "No," he thought, squeezing the tile until the edges painfully pressed his palm. She will come. They always come. And in Al-Sahara, under the same starry sky, Layla was also awake. She did not yet know of the storm approaching, of the invisible pressures that would begin to tighten like a noose around her life. But as she worked on her mosaic, her fingers creating patterns that seemed to defy reality itself, she felt something in the air. A change, subtle but undeniable, like the first breath of wind that precedes the sandstorm. And without knowing why, she looked north, in the direction of Dura al-Fajr, and felt a shiver run down her spine despite the heat of the night. The weeks that followed were like witnessing a flower wither in slow motion. Layla noticed it first in the small things, the 3-day delay in the arrival of paint she had ordered from a supplier in Riyadh, the vague excuse from a merchant who had always been punctual. Then the price of cobalt oxide doubled overnight, without reasonable explanation. And then, like a silent tide that rises imperceptibly until it swallows the beach, the difficulties began to multiply. Hakim, the old mineral merchant she had known since childhood, finally admitted the truth on a muggy afternoon. His eyes, normally bright with cordiality, were clouded with shame as he held Layla's paint-stained hands in his own, dry and trembling. "Child," he whispered, looking over his shoulder as if the very walls had ears. "There are orders from above. Not explicit, you understand, but clear enough. The checkpoints on the roads leading to Al-Sahara are conducting inspections that last hours, asking for documents that were never needed before. Fees have doubled, tripled. The merchants are afraid." Layla felt something tighten in her chest, but maintained a neutral expression. "Afraid of what, Uncle Hakim?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The old merchant didn't need to utter the name. Everyone knew. The Sheikh's shadow was long and reached even the most remote corners of the emirate. Hakim squeezed her hands once more before letting go, his eyes apologizing in ways his mouth could not form. He walked away, leaving Layla alone among the fragrant spices and colorful fabrics of the souk, feeling for the first time the true weight of her refusal. In the workshop, the atmosphere changed too. The 2 young apprentices who assisted her, Nasser and Fatima, began to arrive with worried faces and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered. Fatima, a 16-year-old girl with nimble hands and dreamy eyes who saw in Layla's art a door to a better future, finally gathered the courage to speak. Her father had received a visit from a palace official, nothing threatening in tone, but clear in message. Perhaps it would be better if his daughter found another master to learn a craft. Layla felt anger boil within her, hot and viscous like molten metal. Not against Fatima or her father, who were merely pawns in a game they had not chosen to play, but against the man who moved these pawns with the arrogance of one who never needed to ask, only to take. She held Fatima's face between her hands and looked into the girl's eyes with an intensity that made the tears cease. "You will keep coming," she said, her voice firm. "Your father is afraid, and I understand. But we will not let fear steal what is ours." But the pressures continued. A mysterious fire destroyed part of the warehouse where Layla stored finished tiles, weeks of work turning to ashes in one night. The Al-Sahara firefighters concluded it was an accident, a short circuit in the old wiring, but Layla saw the truth in the evasive glances and overly hasty explanations. Then came the local bank's refusal to renew the small loan that kept the workshop running, a loan on which she had never missed a single payment. Amira watched everything with a deep sadness that came from decades of life and accumulated wisdom. She was 72 and had seen much: wars, droughts, the transformation of Dura al-Fajr from a collection of Bedouin tribes into a modern emirate. She knew that power, when its pride was wounded, could be more destructive than any sandstorm. One night, when the moon was just a thin sickle in the sky, she sat with Layla in the courtyard and spoke in the husky voice of one who had smoked water pipes for many years. "Stubborn child," she began, with no real reprimand in her tone. "Your grandmother had the same fire. She also defied a powerful man once, a lesser Sheikh, who wanted to force her to marry his dissolute son. Do you know what happened?" Layla, who was cleaning dried paint from under her fingernails, looked at her aunt. "No, Grandma never told that story." Amira smiled, but it was a sad smile. She fled. She crossed the desert on foot, alone, for 3 days, until she reached another emirate where she had a distant cousin. There she built a new life, met your grandfather, had children. But the price was high. She could never return home, never saw her parents again before they died. The Sheikh she defied had much anger but little reach. The man you defied has as much anger as reach. The words hung in the warm night air like falcons circling prey. Layla felt their weight, the inevitable truth she didn't want to accept. "So I must flee too?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Abandon everything I have built? Everyone who depends on me, Fatima, Nasa, the women who sell my pieces in the market to feed their families?" Amira shook her head slowly. "I am not saying to flee. I am saying to be smart. There is a difference between courage and suicidal stubbornness. You defied a Sheikh, and he responded. Now he expects you to bend or break. Perhaps there is a third way that neither of you has considered." "What way?" Layla asked, feeling a spark of hope that she immediately tried to stifle. She couldn't afford false hopes. "Go to him," Amira said, her voice surprisingly firm. "Not as a supplicant, but as an equal. Look into that man's eyes and show him what his arrogance is destroying. Not just you, but an entire community. Make him see beyond his own wounded pride." Layla laughed, a bitter sound. "Do you think he will listen to me? A man who uses his power as a club to force a woman to accept his desire?" "Perhaps not," Amira admitted. "But perhaps yes. And what do you have to lose that you are not already losing anyway?" The question echoed in Layla's mind. In the following days, as she watched her workshop dwindle, Nasser stopped coming. His father had forbidden him after losing an important contract without explanation. Fatima still came, but Layla saw the growing fear in her eyes. Orders dried up completely. The merchants who once displayed her pieces in their stalls now returned them with hastily invented excuses. It was on a particularly hot morning, when the sun seemed determined to incinerate everything alive, that Layla made her decision. She was alone in the workshop, surrounded by incomplete mosaics and paint cans she could no longer afford to replace. Her hands, always so sure when creating, trembled slightly as she clenched her fists. Anger and frustration threatened to consume her, but beneath it was something more. An iron determination that came from generations of women who refused to be erased. She washed herself, put on her best dark blue silk abaya, carefully wrapped her hijab around her face. Not to please or seduce, but to show self-respect. If she was going to confront the Sheikh in his own domain, she would do so with dignity. Amira watched her prepare with a mixture of pride and terror when Layla left through the front door. The old woman murmured an ancient prayer, asking for protection for her stubborn girl who had too much courage and too little prudence. The journey from Al-Sahara to Dura al-Fajr took 4 hours in a noisy, uncomfortable shared van that smelled of sweat and spices. Layla spent the time looking out the blurry window, watching the landscape change from golden dunes to skyscrapers that gleamed like mirages against the electric blue sky. The city was a living paradox. Bedouins leading camels alongside latest model Land Rovers, women dressed in traditional abayas carrying international brand bags, ancient minarets competing for space with glass and steel towers. The Emerald Palace dominated the city's skyline like a gigantic crown. Its gates were guarded by men in impeccable uniforms who looked more like magazine models than real soldiers. When Layla approached, her heart beating erratically but her head held high, one of the guards stepped forward. His posture was respectful but firm, a living barrier between her and the palace interior. "I want an audience with the Sheikh Tariq al-Hamad," Layla said, her voice not betraying her inner turmoil. It was her souk negotiation voice, firm and clear. The guard exchanged a look with his companion, a silent communication she couldn't decipher. "Do you have an appointment?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No," Layla admitted, "but he knows me. Tell him Layla Al-Khoury is here. Tell him I came to give my answer personally." The second guard spoke briefly into a discreet radio attached to his belt. There was a long, tense pause where Layla stood under the scorching sun, feeling sweat form under her hijab. Finally, the guard nodded. "You may enter. Someone will come for you." Layla walked through the golden gates, feeling as if she were entering the lion's den. The inner gardens were of a stunning beauty that seemed almost obscene in their opulence. Elaborate fountains, exotic trees, flowers that surely cost fortunes to keep alive in the arid climate. She walked behind a silent palace official, her bare feet under her sandals, feeling the cold of the polished marble, so different from the hot sand of home. And somewhere in the labyrinth of corridors and halls above her, Tariq al-Hamad received the news that the woman who had obsessed his thoughts for weeks had finally come to him. He stood up, abruptly knocking papers from his desk, his heart racing in a way he couldn't explain or control. Victory, he thought first. She bent, but there was something in his expression, a tension in his jaw that his Vizier Rashid immediately recognized as a harbinger of something much more complicated than a simple victory. The audience hall was immense, a space designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. White marble columns rose to a ceiling painted with celestial scenes, where golden cherubs seemed to observe the mortals below with divine indifference. The floor was an elaborate mosaic, ironically made of the same zellige that Layla created, but here used with such extravagance that it seemed more ostentation than art. Tall, arched windows filtered the sunlight into golden rays that cut through the cool gloom of the interior. Layla entered the hall with measured steps, aware that she was being observed by more than just the man on the elevated throne at the end of the corridor. There were advisors in the shadows, guards on the walls, and a tension in the air that made every breath seem too loud, but she did not lower her eyes, did not slow her steps. She walked the length of the hall as if she owned it, not a supplicant, and this simple display of dignity made several invisible witnesses release held breaths. Tariq al-Hamad was seated on an intricately carved wooden throne inlaid with ivory and precious stones, wearing an immaculate white tunic with gold thread details that caught the light with every minimal movement. His face was exactly as the merchants had described, angular, sculpted by generations of noble blood, with dark eyes that seemed capable of seeing through subterfuge. But there was something more, something the descriptions had not captured. A tension around his mouth, a line between his eyebrows that suggested this man carried more weight than his confident posture implied. She stopped at a respectful but not subservient distance, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. It was the first time they had seen each other face to face, and the intensity of that initial gaze seemed to carry the full weight of the preceding weeks. All the pressures and resistances, wounded pride and unshakable determination. It was Rashid, the vizier, who broke the silence. His voice echoed through the marble walls with authority cultivated. "Over decades, you are in the presence of His Excellency the Sheikh Tariq al-Hamad, ruler of Durra al-Fajr, protector of the people, guardian of traditions. State your presence and purpose." Layla briefly shifted her eyes from Tariq to the vizier, And in that brief meeting of gazes, Rashid saw something that made him hesitate. There was no fear there, not even the appropriate caution. There was fire, contained but burning, ready to ignite. "I am Layla Al-Khoury," she said, her voice filling the space with surprising clarity, "artisan of Al-Sahara, daughter of Mariam Al-Khoury, granddaughter of Salma Al-Khoury, whose hands created the mosaics that adorn the Grand Mosque of Mecca. I have come to speak with the Sheikh about the consequences of his actions on my people." A surprised murmur ran through the advisors in the shadows. No one spoke like that before the Sheikh. No one dared to turn an audience into an accusation. Rashid opened his mouth to reprimand her, to put her in her place, but Tariq raised a hand, a small gesture that silenced the vizier immediately. "Approach," Tariq said, his voice lower than Layla expected, almost intimate despite the distance and formality. He leaned slightly forward, his elbows resting on the arms of the throne, studying her with an intensity that seemed physical. "Tell me, Layla Al-Khoury, what do you think you know about my actions?" Layla took 3 steps forward, planting herself firmly at the point where the sunbeams converged, illuminating her as if she were on a stage. "I know that since I refused your proposal, caravans to Al-Sahara have suffered inexplicable delays. I know that merchants with whom I have worked for years are suddenly afraid to trade with me. I know that a fire conveniently destroyed months of work. I know that entire families suffer because a powerful man refuses to hear the word no. The silence that followed was so dense it seemed to have substance." The advisors were shocked. Rashid was pale, and the guards had instinctively stepped forward, awaiting orders to remove this insolent woman. But Tariq merely watched, and something strange happened in his expression. The expected anger did not come. Instead, there was a spark of something that could be respect, or perhaps recognition. "And you came here for what?" he asked, his voice still controlled but with a sharp edge. "To accuse me? To demand justice? Do you know where you are, who I am?" "I know exactly where I am and who you are," Layla replied, and for the first time her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from contained emotion. "I stand before a man who has enough power to change lives, to build or destroy communities with a wave of his hand. I stand before someone who could be a true leader, someone his people would look upon with love and not just obedience. But instead, I see a man who uses that power like a spoiled child, uses toys, breaking what he cannot possess." The comparison was so audacious, so outrageous, that for a moment it seemed as if all the air had been sucked from the hall. One of the older advisors let out a muffled gasp of shock. Rashid closed his eyes briefly, as if witnessing a disaster in slow motion. The guards tightened their grip on their ceremonial weapons, but Tariq slowly rose from the throne and, to everyone's surprise, began to descend the steps that elevated him above the others. He approached Layla with measured steps, each one echoing on the marble, until he stood before her, so close that she could see the small lines around his eyes, feel the warmth emanating from his body, the scent of oud wood that clung to his clothes. "You have courage," he said, his voice now only for her, though everyone in the hall strained to hear. "Or it is extreme foolishness. I have not yet decided which." "Perhaps both," Layla replied, meeting his eyes without blinking. "You forced me to come here, so now you will listen to me. You need to hear what your arrogance is costing. Not me, though I suffer too, but the people you are supposed to protect." And then, without waiting for permission, without caring about protocol or consequences, Layla began to speak. She told of Fatima, the 16-year-old girl whose dream was to be an artisan, whose father now forbade her from following that path for fear of reprisals. She spoke of Nasser, a 20-year-old who supported 5 younger siblings with what he earned as an apprentice, who now had no job because his father had mysteriously lost a contract. She described the widows who sold her pieces in the market to buy medicine for sick children who now had nothing to sell. Her voice gained strength as she spoke, painting pictures with words as she painted pictures with tiles. She made Tariq see Al-Sahara not as a distant and inconvenient city, but as a real place with real people. She spoke of the city's history, of how artisans had created beauty there for generations, of how every street and every house had a story. And she spoke of her art, not with vanity, but with the passion of one who sees in it something sacred, a way to touch the divine through patterns and colors. Tariq listened in silence, and something extraordinary happened within him. For the first time in his adult life, he was truly seeing beyond himself. He had always been the center of the universe, the sun around which everything revolved. But here was this woman, making him see entire constellations he had ignored, worlds that existed completely independent of his power and will. And with that vision came something uncomfortable: shame. She spoke for long minutes, and no one dared to interrupt her. When she finally finished, when her words ran out and she stood there, breathing heavily, eyes shining with contained tears of frustration and passion, silence returned to the hall. But it was a different silence now, laden with the weight of truth spoken unfiltered. Tariq studied her face, truly seeing it for the first time. It was not the conventional beauty that had initially attracted him, though she had her own form of beauty. It was the intensity, the absolute authenticity, the complete absence of pretense or manipulation. This woman was not trying to win him over or deceive him. She was simply being herself, completely and unapologetically, and that was more seductive than any game or performance could be. "You defy me before my court," he said finally, his voice thoughtful. "You accuse me of cruelty and arrogance. You compare me to a child. Do you know what others have done for less than that?" "I know," Layla replied, raising her chin. "But I did not come here to bow down. I came because someone needs to show you what you're doing, and if that means suffering the consequences, then so be it. But I will not regret having spoken the truth." Tariq remained silent for a long moment, and then did something that shocked everyone present. He smiled. It was not a smile of cruelty or triumph, but something softer, almost admiring. "You mentioned the Grand Mosque of Mecca. The mosaics there are indeed magnificent. I saw them when I was young. My grandmother created them," Layla said, feeling the ground shift under her feet with this unexpected change of tone. "She spent 3 years on that project. She said each tile was a prayer." Tariq nodded slowly. "I have a proposal for you. Not the previous one, not a marriage proposal or an attempt to possess you. Something different." He gestured around the hall at the expensive but soulless mosaics that covered the walls. "This palace has wealth, but it lacks what your grandmother gave to the Grand Mosque. It lacks soul." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "Create for me the greatest Zeliger panel ever made. Something that tells a story, that has meaning, something that makes people stop and feel. If you complete this work with your integrity and tact, I swear by my father's name that I will remove all restrictions on Al-Sahara. More than that, I will make your city a protected center of art and commerce." Layla studied him, looking for signs of deceit or manipulation. "What if I refuse this too?" she asked. "Then we are both stubborn fools," Tariq replied with surprising honesty. "And we will both lose something precious. You lose your art, your livelihood. I lose the chance to have something real in this palace of empty things. The choice is yours, as it always has been." Layla looked around the hall, at the shocked advisors, at Rashid, who watched with an unreadable expression, at the guards who seemed confused about what to do with this unprecedented situation, and then she looked back at Tariq, at those dark eyes, that for the first time seemed to see her as more than an object of desire or a challenge to be conquered. "Will I have complete creative freedom?" she asked. No interference, no orders about what should or should not be in the work. Total, Tariq confirmed. Art must be free, or it is not true art. And does my workshop in Al-Sahara remain independent? Can my apprentices return without fear? The restrictions will be removed tomorrow at dawn. Layla took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision. It was not trust in the Sheikh that led her to accept, but the understanding that this was her best chance to save not only her art, but the entire community that depended on her. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was curiosity about whether this man could truly change, whether there was something more beneath the armor of power and pride. "I accept," she said finally, "but with one condition. I want it in writing, witnessed by your vizier and the elders of Al-Sahara, and I want all necessary materials provided free of charge, as it was your interference that destroyed my resources." Tariq felt something strange in his chest, a sensation that took a moment to identify. He was proud of her, this woman who faced him as an equal, who negotiated terms instead of simply accepting gratitude. "It will be done," he said, extending his hand. Layla looked at the offered hand for a long moment before accepting it. The grip was firm on both sides, an agreement sealed not with submission, but with mutual respect. And at that moment, with their hands joined, something fundamentally changed between them. Something neither of them yet fully understood, but which both felt like an electric current running through their connected palms. The months that followed brought an unexpected transformation for both. The agreement was formalized with appropriate ceremony, witnessed by Rashid and the elders of Al-Sahara, who traveled to Durra al-Fajr, still distrustful but hopeful. The restrictions were removed as promised, and Layla found materials of the highest quality being delivered to her workshop. Tiles imported from Marrakesh, rare pigments from India, elaborate tools from Turkey. Everything paid for by the palace, all part of the agreement she had negotiated with firm hands and a determined heart. But the work itself was too large to be completed in Al-Sahara. Tariq had proposed a project of monumental scale, a Zellige panel that would cover an entire wall of the new cultural center he planned to build in the heart of Durra al-Fajr. 15 meters wide, 8 meters high, a sea of tiles that would tell a story of the peninsula itself, of its traditions and modernity, of its past and future. It was ambitious to the point of audacity, but not impossible. Layla agreed to establish a temporary workshop in one of the pavilions of the palace complex, a practical concession she negotiated carefully. She would not stay in the main chambers, would not be treated as a guest or worse, property. She would have her own space, her own entrance, her own life. Fatima and Nasser came with her, their faces mixing excitement and nervousness as they stepped for the first time into the glittering world of Durra al-Fajr. The pavilion assigned to them was airy and lit by large windows that captured the perfect natural light for delicate work. Layla quickly transformed it into a functional space, lined with her materials and tools, the familiar scent of pigments and glue gradually replacing the perfume of roses that permeated everything. In the palace, it was her sanctuary, her territory, and she defended it fiercely against any attempt at intrusion. Tariq, for the first time in his life, found himself in the unusual position of being kept at a distance. He wanted to visit, to see the progress, perhaps just to observe Layla work, but she had established clear rules from the beginning. The work was sacred, the process could not be interrupted. If he wanted to visit, he had to ask for permission in advance, and she had the right to refuse. This frustrated him immensely, but also intrigued him. Never before had anyone set limits for him, and he found that there was something unexpectedly attractive in this denial. The first approved visit happened 3 weeks after Layla settled in the pavilion. Tariq arrived at dusk, when the golden light of the setting sun transformed everything into shades of honey and amber. He knocked on the door, A simple but significant gesture that made Rashid, who accompanied him, raise an eyebrow in surprise. No one knocked on doors inside the palace itself, but here was the Zeke waiting for permission to enter. Layla opened the door with hands stained, turquoise blue, a smudge of golden pigment on her face. Her hijab was loosely fastened, and there was an intense concentration in her eyes that slowly focused on him. "Ah," she said, as if she had forgotten the appointment. "Come in, but don't touch anything." The interior of the pavilion was an organized chaos. Benches covered with hundreds of tiles in various stages of completion, sketches pinned to the walls showing the complete panel design, pots of paint arranged in a rainbow spectrum. Fatima was carefully applying glaze to a series of geometric pieces, while Nasser organized the completed pieces on large trays. Both stopped upon seeing the Zeke, their expressions tense. "Continue," Layla instructed, returning to her own workbench. "We are not a spectacle." Tariq walked slowly through the space, aware that he was in her territory now. He observed the scattered pieces, beginning to see how they would fit into the larger whole. A pattern was emerging, something that began with chaos at the edges and gradually evolved into order in the center, as if representing the journey of creation itself. "It's ambitious," he commented. "You asked for something grand," Layla replied without looking up, her hands moving, with surgical precision as she applied pigment to a tile. Grandeur requires ambition. Rashid, who had followed Tariq in silence, studied the work with appreciative eyes. He had seen enough art in his long life to recognize something special when he saw it, and there was something almost magical in the way these seemingly disconnected pieces promised to become a cohesive whole. "It's different from traditional work," he observed. Layla finally looked up, and for the first time, Tariq saw something like pleasure in her expression. "Yes, my grandmother taught me the classical techniques, but she also taught me that art needs to evolve or it dies. I'm incorporating modern elements, abstractions that represent the present, but the basis is still sacred geometry, the patterns our ancestors developed when they tried to capture the infinite in finite forms." "Why?" Tariq asked, genuinely curious. "Why is geometry so important in Islamic art?" Layla put her brush aside and turned to him, and for the first time since they met, there was something almost like openness in her posture. "Because the divine cannot be represented directly," she explained, "so we use patterns, mathematics, the language of the universe to suggest what it cannot be shown. Every line, every angle, every repetition is a wordless prayer." There was passion in her voice when she spoke of her art, an intensity that transformed her. Tariq found himself fascinated not only by what she said, but by how she said it, by the way her eyes lit up, how her hands gestured, describing concepts that transcended words. This was the real Layla, not the furious woman who had confronted him in his audience hall, not the cautious negotiator who had set terms, but the artist at the heart of her passion. The visits became more frequent, always prearranged, always respecting the limits Layla had established. Sometimes Tariq just observed in silence. Other times he asked questions that revealed a genuine curiosity about the process. He learned about different types of glazes, about how temperature and time affected colors, about the infinite patience needed to create something truly beautiful. And as the months passed, something subtle but profound began to change between them. Conversations expanded beyond art. Layla asked about the functioning of the emirate, about the decisions Tariq had to make, the challenges of governing in a world that changed so rapidly. He, in turn, learned about life in Al-Sahara, about traditions that were being lost, about the struggle to maintain cultural identity in the face of relentless modernization. One night, when the moon was full, and the desert air finally brought relief from the day's heat, Tariq found Layla sitting alone in the small garden next to the pavilion. She was looking at the stars, a forgotten cup of tea cooling in her hands. He hesitated, almost turning back, but something made him stay. "May I join you?" he asked, and when she nodded affirmatively, he sat at a respectful distance on the stone wall. They remained silent for long minutes, just observing the night sky painted with ancient constellations. Finally, Layla spoke, her voice soft. "My grandmother used to say that the stars are holes in the veil that separates this world from the next, places where divine light leaks through the darkness. My father said they were just gases burning billions of kilometers away," Tariq replied, a note of melancholy in his voice. He believed only in what he could measure and control. "And you? What do you believe?" Tariq thought for a long moment. "I used to believe like my father, that everything was about power, control, resources, that feelings were weaknesses, and that a leader should be above such things." He paused. "But you made me question that. You made me see that there is another kind of power, the power to create, to inspire, to touch people in ways that gold never could." Layla turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw not the arrogant Sheikh who had sent pressures against her life, but a man struggling with concepts that were new and uncomfortable for him. There was vulnerability in that confession, an honesty she did not expect. "You asked me to create something with soul," she said slowly. "But do you realize that to recognize soul in art, you need to have some in yourself? Perhaps the problem is not that you don't have it, but that you were taught to hide it so well that you forgot where it was. The words hung between them like a fragile bridge over an abyss." Tariq felt something stir within him, something he had buried for so long that he had almost forgotten it existed. "How does one find something that has been lost for so long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stop running from it," Layla replied, her eyes meeting his in the silver moonlight. "Stop trying to control everything. Let yourself feel, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts." The silence that followed was charged with something new, something neither of them was ready to name. It was not the simple desire Tariq had initially felt, nor the defensive anger that had dominated Layla's first encounters. It was something deeper, more complex, understanding perhaps, or the beginning of the recognition that despite their differences, they were similar souls wounded by expectations and roles they never chose. Inside the palace, however, not everyone observed this growing transformation with approval. Prince Malik, Tariq's cousin and his perpetual rival for influence and eventually the throne, noticed every visit to the pavilion, every prolonged gaze, every subtle change in the Sheikh's behavior. Malik was a man of sharp features and an easy smile that concealed deep ambitions and even deeper resentments. He had waited patiently for years for any sign of weakness in Tariq, any opportunity to destabilize his position. And now, observing from a distant window, seeing Tariq and Layla sitting together under the stars with an intimacy that transcended any need for physical proximity, Malik smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted the perfect prey. A common artisan distracting the Sheikh from his duties, making him neglect matters of state for conversations about art and soul. This could be useful, very useful indeed. He turned away from the window and went to his chambers, where he would begin to weave the threads of a plot that would exploit precisely this apparent weakness. Malik would not attack directly, he was too subtle for that, but there were other ways to destroy alliances and affections, starting with whispers in the right places, doubts planted in the right minds, fears cultivated in insecure hearts. And so, as Layla and Tariq slowly began to build something delicate and precious between them, forces they did not fully understand were already moving to destroy it. The desert, after all, was as good at burying as it was at preserving. And not every treasure buried in its sands was destined to be found. The first signs of sabotage were too subtle to be noticed immediately. A batch of tiles, arrived cracked, supposedly due to negligent transport. Expensive pigments were accidentally spilled by a new and nervous servant who disappeared before he could be questioned. One of the kilns used to fire the pieces stopped working, delaying the work by 2 weeks while waiting for repairs. Layla was frustrated but not suspicious. Accidents happened, especially on such an ambitious project. It was Fatima who first verbalized the doubt, one afternoon when another inexplicable problem arose. "Doesn't it seem strange?" the girl asked, her voice low, as she and Layla organized what was left of a shipment of tiles that had mysteriously arrived broken. So many things going wrong in such quick succession. Layla stopped, a broken tile in her hands, and for the first time considered the possibility. But before she could answer, Nasser ran in, his face pale and eyes wide. "The sketches!" he gasped. "The sketches of the complete design. They're gone." Layla's heart sank. Those sketches were irreplaceable, months of meticulous planning, every measurement and pattern carefully documented. Without them, the entire project could be compromised. She ran to the locked cabinet where she kept them, finding the lock forced and the shelves empty. There was no doubt now. This was not a series of accidents. It was deliberate sabotage. When Tariq learned of it, his reaction was immediate and furious. He summoned the heads of security, demanding investigations, threatening severe consequences. But even in his anger, Layla saw something more. He was genuinely distressed, not only because his project was at risk, but because something she valued was being attacked. It was a different kind of anger, more personal, less about pride, and more about protection. "I can recreate them," Layla said calmly, placing a hand on Tariq's arm to soothe him. "It's extra work. But I have the main measurements memorized. The design lives here." She touched her own temple, and here she touched her heart. But Tariq was not easily calmed. "This is more than an inconvenience," he insisted. "It's an attack on you, on the project. And when something under my protection is attacked, it's an attack on me." Layla felt something stir in those words. The possessiveness was still there, but transformed. It was no longer about controlling her, but about protecting something he had come to genuinely value. It was a subtle but crucial distinction. It was Rashid who eventually discovered the truth, or at least part of it. Through loyal contacts and careful investigation, he traced the accidents to a network of servants who had been bribed or coerced, and all the threads eventually led back to one source: Prince Malik. When he confronted Tariq with this information in a private meeting in his chambers, the vizier chose his words with extreme care. "My lord," he began, "you must understand that this is more complex than simple jealousy or envy. Your cousin sees in your growing affection for Miss Al-Khoury an opportunity to sow discord. There are factions in the court that never approved of this project. They see it as a Sheikh wasting resources on whims, being distracted from matters of state by a common woman." "She is not common," Tariq replied with a vehemence that surprised even himself. "And this project is not a whim. It is an investment in culture, in beauty, in something that will last generations." Rashid nodded patiently. "I agree, my lord. But you need to understand how this appears to others. Malik is using this to undermine your authority, suggesting that you are being controlled by emotions instead of reason. And there is enough truth in that to make his words persuasive. The words were like a slap." Tariq stood up abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the garden where he had had that transformative conversation with Layla under the stars. "Do you also think this?" he asked without turning around. "That I am being controlled?" Rashid considered his answer carefully. "I think you are changing, my lord, and change always frightens those invested in the status quo. The question is not whether your emotions are legitimate, but how you handle them publicly. Malik is exploiting the perception of weakness. You need to show strength, but of the right kind." Tariq turned, his dark eyes fixed on his vizier. "And what kind of strength do you suggest? The kind that protects what you value without appearing weak for valuing it. Expose Malik publicly. Convene a majlis, an open assembly. Let the people see and judge for themselves." The suggestion was risky. A public majlis meant opening internal matters to general scrutiny. It meant potentially revealing his own vulnerabilities. But Tariq was tired of games in the shadows, of whispers and sabotages. If he had learned anything from Layla, it was the value of direct honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. "Prepare the majlis," he ordered. "I want all the notables present, and inform my dear cousin that his presence is mandatory." The night before the majlis, Tariq went to the pavilion without warning. He found Layla working alone. Everyone else had already gone to sleep. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice his arrival until he spoke. "Do you always work so late?" Layla started, almost knocking over a pot of blue pigment. "My thoughts don't let me sleep," she admitted, putting aside her tool. "So I work." Tariq entered the pavilion more fully, his eyes tracing the visible progress of the panel. It was already 1/3 complete, and even in this unfinished state, it was breathtaking. The patterns flowed like water. Colors mingled and contrasted in ways that seemed impossible, but inevitable at the same time. "You know about the problems," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know." Fatima overheard some of the guards talking. "Your cousin," she said simply. Tariq nodded, appreciating that she didn't try to feign ignorance or protect him from the truth. "I am convening a majlis tomorrow. It will be complicated." Layla studied him for a long moment. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Why risk your political position for an art project?" The question caught him off guard. He had reflected on it, but verbalizing the answer was different. "Because," he said slowly, "for the first time in my life, I am doing something that matters beyond power and politics. You showed me that. You showed me that there is value in beauty, in creating instead of just controlling. And I will not let my cousin or anyone else destroy that." There was passion in his voice that made Layla take a step closer. "Your life was simpler before you met me," she said, and there was a note of guilt in her voice. "Perhaps," Tariq admitted, "but it was empty. I just didn't realize it because I never knew anything else." They stood there, a few steps apart, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. For the first time, Layla saw Tariq not as the Sheikh who had tried to force her to submit, nor as the ruler she had negotiated with as an equal, but as a man, flawed, complex, capable of growth and change. And with that perception came something dangerous, empathy, perhaps even the beginning of something more. "I will go to the majlis tomorrow," she said suddenly, surprising both of them. "If this is about my work, about me, I have the right to be present." Tariq wanted to argue, to protect her from the hostility she would certainly face. But he remembered who she was, the strength that had defined her from the very first moment. "You will face opposition. Some of the more conservative elders will not like a woman speaking in a majlis." Layla smiled, and there was steel in that smile. "It wouldn't be the first time I've defied expectations, and you will be there, won't you?" The question was simple, but carried layers of meaning. "I will be," Tariq promised, and for the first time, he fully understood what that promise meant. It was not just about being physically present, but about publicly supporting her, about choosing whose side he would be on even when it was difficult. That night, both barely slept. Tariq rehearsed strategies and arguments, preparing for the confrontation he knew would come. Layla finished more pieces of the panel, her hands working at a frantic pace, as if each tile placed was a declaration, a proof that her work was worth any fight. And in the shadows, Malik also prepared. He had gathered his allies, practiced his speeches, planted seeds of doubt in minds that were already fertile with prejudice. He was confident that by the end of the Majlis, Tariq's position would be fatally weakened, and when a leader was weak, there was always someone waiting to take his place. Dawn arrived clear and relentless, the sun rising over Dura al-Fajr like a silent judge. And as the city awoke, aware of the extraordinary assembly that would take place, everyone could feel that something fundamental was about to change, not just for the Zeke and the artisan, but for the entire emirate. Choices would be made, lines would be drawn, and when the sun set again, nothing would be exactly as it was before. The palace's grand hall had never seen an assembly like it. The notables of Dura al-Fajr filled the space, elders in white turbans and long beards, wealthy merchants in embroidered tunics, religious scholars in their simple robes, members of the royal family in their ceremonial attire. Women observed. From an elevated gallery, their presence silent but palpable, the tension in the air was physical, dense enough to be cut. Tariq entered, dressed with relative simplicity for the occasion, a white tunic without the usual golden excesses. It was a deliberate choice, a subtle declaration that he came as a leader, not as a distant monarch. He took his place on the elevated platform, Rashid on one side, the space traditionally reserved for close members of the royal family on the other. Malik sat there, his face a mask of respectful concern that did not reach his calculating eyes. The formalities were observed, the prayers recited, and then Tariq stood, his voice filling the hall with the authority of one born to govern. I have convened this Majlis because matters of importance to our emirate need to be discussed openly before all. There have been accusations, whispers in the shadows, sabotage of a project I personally approved. The time has come to bring light to these shadows. A murmur ran through the assembly. This was not the usual protocol. Normally such matters would be resolved discreetly, behind closed doors. Tariq's radical openness made many uncomfortable, but also fascinated. Malik stood, his expression of concern seemingly sincere. "Dear cousin," he began, his voice measured and respectful, "if there are matters that trouble you, they could surely be resolved privately, among family. Exposing internal disputes in public weakens our position before other emirates." It was a clever move, framing Tariq's openness as weakness. But Tariq was prepared. "It weakens our position," he replied, "or does it strengthen our legitimacy by showing that we do not fear scrutiny? Governance in the shadows was my father's method. Perhaps it is time for a new path." The comment caused a mixed reaction. Some older elders frowned, loyal to the memory of the old Sheikh Faisal. Others, especially the younger ones, nodded in approval. Tariq continued, his voice gaining strength. "My cousin suggests that I have been distracted, that I have wasted resources on whims." He refers to the art project in the cultural center, to the hiring of Layla Al-Khoury, master artisan of Al-Sahara. "So let me speak clearly about this." He paused, letting the silence build expectation. "I inherited an emirate rich in oil and trade. But wealth without culture is empty. Power without beauty is tyranny. What legacy will we leave when the oil runs out? Just empty glass towers? Or something that touches the human soul, that makes people remember Dura al-Fajr with reverence and not just greed?" It was then that Layla entered the hall. She had dressed traditionally but elegantly, a night blue abaya embroidered with silver threads, a hijab framing her face in a way that showed determination without arrogance. Her entrance caused visible shock. Women occasionally attended majlis from the gallery, but never entered the main hall, never positioned themselves to potentially speak. Malik saw his opportunity. "This is outrageous," he exclaimed, his voice echoing performative indignation. "A woman, not only present but clearly prepared to violate the decorum of this sacred assembly. This is exactly what I feared, cousin. You are so enchanted that you forget millennia-old traditions. Layla stopped in the center of the hall, exactly where the sunbeams converged, illuminating her dramatically. When she spoke, her voice was clear and firm, without a trace of fear. I ask forgiveness if my presence offends, but when my work and character are discussed, I have the right to defend myself. Or is the Majlis not about justice? It was a brilliant move, invoking justice, a fundamental principle of Sharia, created a moral dilemma for those who wanted to remove her. One of the most respected elders, Sheikh Ibrahim, known for his wisdom and adherence to traditions, slowly stood up. His words carried a weight that few could match. The woman is correct. If we accuse her directly or indirectly, she must be able to respond. This is basic Sharia. Malik realized his mistake, but it was too late to back down. He changed tactics. Very well, then let the artisan explain why she, a common woman with no noble connections, should receive resources that could go to more practical projects, hospitals, schools, roads. Layla met Malik's eyes directly. I am not noble, it is true. I was born in Al-Sahara, daughter of artisans, granddaughter of masters who created beauty for great mosques and palaces. And yes, there are practical needs in the emirate. But allow me to ask this assembly something. When you visit the Grand Mosque of Mecca, what moves you? The engineering calculations or the beauty that touches your souls? When you read Sufi poetry, is it the grammar that transforms your hearts or the truths it reveals? She paused, letting the questions sink in. We are beings with souls, not just bodies with needs. Art is not a luxury. It is what reminds us of our humanity, our connection to the divine. And if Dura al-Fajr aspires to be great, it needs to cultivate not only wealth, but wisdom, not only power, but beauty. There was power in her words, an eloquence that came from genuine passion. Even those initially hostile to her presence found themselves listening, considering. A wealthy merchant stood up. But what about the accusations of waste? The costs of this project are substantial, Tariq answered before Layla could. Every dirham spent is documented and can be audited. More importantly, this project employs dozens of artisans, revitalizes Al-Sahara, and creates something permanent. When my father built the new financial district, the cost was 100 times greater. No one called that a waste because it was about money. This is about soul, and apparently soul is controversial. There was bitterness in his words that resonated with many. Malik felt the assembly turning and made his final and most desperate move. Then explain, cousin, your relationship with this woman. Why her specifically? There are rumors, whispers that you are obsessed, that she exerts undue influence. The silence that followed was absolute, all eyes fixed on Tariq, awaiting his response. This was the central question, the insinuation Malik had been carefully planting, that the Sheikh was being controlled by a woman, that his judgment was compromised by desire. Tariq stood, and when he spoke, there was a vulnerability in his voice that shocked everyone. Do you want to know the truth? He asked, looking around the hall. Yes, I have affection for Layla Al-Khoury. I'm not ashamed of it. She showed me that power without purpose is empty, that controlling everything is, not living anything. She challenged me when all of you merely agreed, and yes, that changed my perspective. He paused, allowing the words to settle. But to suggest that I am being controlled is to insult both her and me. This project was my idea, my approval, my choice. If there is a mistake, it is mine, but I do not believe it is a mistake to value art and culture. I believe it is evolution. He turned to Malik directly. As for your sabotage, cousin, yes, sabotage. I have evidence that you paid servants to damage materials, steal designs. You do not oppose the project on principle, but because you see political opportunity. You wanted to weaken me by showing that I am distractible, emotional. Perhaps I am, but I prefer to be a human leader with emotions than a cold tyrant." The direct accusation left Malik pale. "This is outrageous. How dare you accuse me without proof?" Rashid stood, holding documents. "Here are the testimonies of 3 servants you hired, full confessions, signed and witnessed." "You were not as careful as you thought, Malik." The drama had reached its climax. Malik, seeing that he was cornered, made a last emotional appeal. "I did what I did for love of the emirate, for concern that you are compromising our future, for a woman," Layla finished for him, her voice cutting through the air. "Say it. That's what you think, that women can be nothing but distractions or possessions. But let me tell you something, Prince Malik. My grandmother created works that last centuries. What have you created beyond intrigues that die with you?" The harsh truth of her words echoed in the silence. Sheikh Ibrahim stood again, his voice carrying the authority of decades. "I have heard. Enough. There are serious accusations against Prince Malik. There are also legitimate questions about tradition versus modernity. But I see leadership that has the courage to admit vulnerability, and I see an artisan who defends not only her work, but broader principles. That impresses me more than dirty politics." Other elders began to nod. One by one, notables stood to speak, some in support, some with reservations, but a consensus emerged. Transparency was valued, sabotage was condemned, and perhaps there was wisdom in balancing material progress with cultural enrichment. When the Majlis finally dissolved hours later, the result was clear. Though not absolute, Malik would be formally investigated, his role in government reduced. The art project would continue, but with committee oversight to ensure fiscal responsibility. And perhaps most importantly, Tariq had shown a different kind of leadership, one that recognized emotions as strength, not weakness. But the cost had been high. He had exposed his feelings publicly, made himself vulnerable, and while some respected that, others would see it as a future opportunity. The political desert was relentless, and fragility, even when admirable, could be exploited. The weeks after the Majlis brought a strange calm, like the tense silence that precedes sandstorms. Malik had retreated to his inland property, officially to reflect, but everyone knew he was simply waiting for the right moment to resurface. The investigation into his actions continued, but slowly, hampered by complex loyalties and fear of destabilizing the power structure too much. For Layla, those days were filled with intense work and even more intense reflection. The panel was almost complete now, a monumental work that surpassed even her own expectations. But each tile placed was accompanied by thoughts about what had happened in the Majlis, about Tariq's words, about her own feelings that had changed in ways she barely understood. She was in love. The realization came on a silent night while she worked alone, her hands moving automatically as her mind wandered. It wasn't the sudden love of romances, but something that had grown gradually, built on hard-won respect, on conversations that revealed souls, on witnessing the genuine transformation of a man who had started as an antagonist and had become... what exactly? Partner seemed too weak. Soulmate seemed presumptuous, but some deep connection had formed, undeniable and frightening in equal measure. The problem was that Layla didn't know what to do with this realization. She had built her entire identity on independence, on refusing to be defined or possessed by any man. And now, here she was, feeling her heart race when she heard Tariq's footsteps in the corridors, searching for his face in crowds, treasuring his words. It felt like a betrayal of herself, or perhaps an evolution. The line between both was terribly thin. Tariq faced his own demons. The Majlis had been a victory, but a costly one. He had exposed vulnerabilities that more cynical politicians would certainly exploit eventually. And his statements about Layla, though honest, created expectations. The court openly speculated about marriage, about whether the artisan would become a consort, about how this would change the power dynamic. These were conversations he would have to address, but he didn't know how. Because the truth was that Tariq didn't know what Layla wanted. She had agreed to work for him, had publicly defended the project, but that didn't mean she wanted more. He vividly remembered how she had refused his initial proposal, how she valued her independence above all else. It would be cruel to propose again, to force her to choose between her art and himself. But the idea of not trying, of simply letting her go when the project ended, was unbearable. It was Rashid who finally forced the conversation they both avoided. He found Tariq one afternoon, sitting in his private chambers, staring blankly at state documents that needed attention. "My lord," the vizier began with the frankness that decades of loyal service allowed, "you need to decide what you want. Not just about Miss Al-Khoury, but about what kind of leader you are becoming." Tariq looked up, surprised by the directness of the approach. "Explain." Rashid sat down uninvited, a privileged few would have. "You have changed, and that is good. But change without direction is just chaos. In the Majlis, you defended a new form of leadership, more open, more human. Beautiful in theory. But in practice, how does that translate into real politics, into difficult decisions that come with governance?" "I don't know," Tariq admitted. "My father governed with an iron fist. I was trained to continue that legacy. But the more I see Layla create, the more I understand about art and soul, the more I realize there is another way. I just don't know how to walk it." "Then learn," Rashid said simply, "and stop avoiding the conversation you need to have with her. The project is almost finished. What happens next? Does she go back to Al-Sahara? Do you part politely, and you spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been? Or do you honor the courage you showed in the Majlis and have an honest conversation about feelings?" The words were sensible, but terrifying. Tariq, who had never feared political or economic confrontations, found himself paralyzed by the prospect of real, emotional vulnerability. "What if she rejects me again?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then you survive," Rashid replied with surprising gentleness, "like everyone who has loved and lost. But at least you will know. Uncertainty is worse than rejection because it kills by degrees, day after day." While this conversation was happening in the palace, Layla was having her own in the pavilion. Amira had traveled from Al-Sahara specifically to see the panel's progress, but also to check on her niece. The old woman had sharp eyes and saw what Layla tried to hide even from herself. "You love him," Amira said without preamble, watching Layla work with hands that were not as steady as they used to be. "Don't deny it. I've known you since you were a baby. I see it in your eyes, in the way you talk about him, even when you try to be casual." Layla stopped, a tile suspended in the air, and then carefully put it aside before turning to her aunt. "If I say yes," she began slowly, "what does that make me? I've spent my entire life fighting to be more than some man's property, and now you've discovered that love doesn't have to be a prison, Amira. Completed, that two adults can choose each other without one consuming the other. Your grandfather and I had that kind of love. He never tried to diminish me, and I never tried to control him. We were partners. But he is a Zike," Layla protested. "There are expectations, traditions. If I stayed with him, what would I become? Consort? Wife? An ornament in his palace?" "You would be what you choose to be," Amira replied firmly. "He has changed, Layla. I saw it in the Majlis. This is not a man who forces, this is a man who asks. Yes, there are complexities, there will be challenges. But when there is true love, one finds ways. But what about my art, my workshop in Al-Sahara, everything I have built? Why would you need to abandon anything? Amira asked. Child, you think too much in absolutes, either this or that. Why not both? Why not create a new way of existing that honors everything you are? The conversation left Layla thoughtful. She continued working, but her hands moved automatically as her mind explored possibilities. Could she love Tariq without losing herself? Could she find a way to be with him that didn't require sacrificing her identity or independence? The questions were too big, too complex for easy answers. It was Fatima who eventually created the moment that would force both of them to confront what they felt. The young apprentice, with the impulsiveness of youth, innocently asked during a visit from Tariq to the pavilion, "Are you going to get married when the panel is complete?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Layla blushed, Tariq froze, and Nasser discreetly tried to slap Fatima, who immediately realized she had said something profoundly inappropriate. "Sorry," she stammered. "I just thought everyone talks." "I shouldn't have—" "No," Layla said, her voice surprisingly calm. "It's a fair question, and it deserves an honest answer, not whispers and speculations." She turned to Tariq, her eyes meeting his directly. "Do you want to marry me?" The question, asked so directly, without romance or preparation, left Tariq speechless for a moment. And then, perhaps because Layla's brutal honesty always inspired his own, he responded with equal directness. "Yes, but I don't know if you want to marry me. Or more importantly, if you should. I know you value your independence. I don't want to be a golden cage that you escape. I'd rather have you happy and free away from me than miserable and trapped with me." The vulnerability in his words, the way he prioritized her well-being over his own desires, touched something deep in Layla. This was not the arrogant man who had sent a pompous proposal months ago. This was someone who had learned, grown, changed. "What if," Layla said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke, "it wasn't about marrying in traditional terms? What if we created our own form of union? I keeping my workshop in Al-Sahara, my independence, my voice. You keeping your responsibilities as Sheikh, but choosing each other, not out of obligation or tradition, but because we want to. Because what we build together is stronger than what we would have apart." It was a radical proposal, challenging norms and expectations. Tariq could have rejected it, insisted on traditional terms, but instead he smiled, that rare and genuine smile that transformed his features. "Would that work?" he asked. "Politically? Socially?" "Probably not," Layla admitted. "But many things that work shouldn't, and many that don't work should. I'm willing to try if you are." Tariq crossed the distance between them. In 3 long strides, he stopped so close that she could see every detail of his eyes, see the emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I am," he said simply. And then, for the first time, he kissed her. It was a kiss that contained months of tension, of charged conversations, of prolonged gazes, but it also contained promise, hope, the possibility of something new and undefined, something they would create together as Layla created her mosaics, piece by piece, color by color, until something beautiful emerged from the chaos. When they separated, Fatima was smiling broadly. Nasser looked relieved, and Amira, who had silently appeared at the door, simply nodded with satisfaction, as if she had orchestrated all of this from the beginning. Perhaps she had. The panel was only weeks from completion, and when it was ready, when that monumental work was finally revealed to the world, it would also reveal a new chapter, not for Layla, not for Tariq, but for both of them together, creating something that neither could do alone. The last tile was placed on a spring morning, when the air still carried coolness before the brutal heat of the day. Layla held the piece for a long moment, a perfect turquoise-blue hexagon that captured the light like living water. It was the centerpiece, the heart of the panel, and placing it meant the end of months of work, but also the beginning of something still not fully defined. Her hands, permanently stained by pigments that had become part of her skin, trembled slightly as she pressed the tile into place. The sound of the fit was soft but definitive, like a breath being released after being held for a long time. And then it was done. The complete panel stretched before her in all its impossible glory, 15 meters wide, 8 meters high, thousands of individual pieces that somehow unified in perfect harmony. The design told the story of the Arabian Peninsula in abstract yet recognizable forms. At the edges, chaotic patterns represented the wild desert, the nomadic tribes, the harsh but free life. Gradually, as the gaze moved towards the center, order emerged. Mosques rising from the sands, caravans connecting distant worlds, wisdom being preserved in illuminated manuscripts. And at the heart, where Layla had just placed the last tile, was something that transcended literal representation, an explosion of colors and patterns that suggested both past and future, tradition and innovation, the eternal and the momentary existing simultaneously. Tariq stood behind her, observing in reverent silence. He had learned, in those months, that sometimes witnessing was more powerful than participating. When Layla finally stepped back, allowing herself to look at the completed work for the first time, he saw tears stream down her face. Not from sadness, but from something deeper, the satisfaction of creating something that surpassed the sum of its parts, something that would live beyond her. "It's perfect," he whispered, though the words seemed inadequate to capture what he saw. "It's not perfect," Layla replied, her voice hoarse with emotion. "There are imperfections if you look closely. A slightly crooked line there, a color that isn't exactly the shade I planned. But that makes it real. Perfection is for the divine. We create imperfect and human beauty." Tariq approached, standing beside her, their shoulders almost touching. Together, they looked at the work that had transformed both of them. The panel was beautiful, undeniably, but it was also a testament to a journey, of a woman who refused to be possessed and a man who learned that control was not true power, of confrontations that turned into understanding, of pride that bowed before truth, of two souls who found in each other not completeness, but complementarity. The official inauguration of the cultural center was planned for the following week, but before that, Layla wanted a private moment with those who had made it all possible. She summoned Fatima and Nasser, Amira who had remained in Dura al-Fajr to witness the completion, and surprisingly, Rashid, whose silent but firm support had been crucial in difficult moments. They gathered in the almost complete hall at night, when the starlight filtered through. High windows and soft lamps illuminated the panel from angles that made the colors dance and change. Layla spoke, her voice echoing softly in the vast space. "This work is not just mine," she said. "It is ours. Every person here contributed in ways that go beyond technique or support. You showed me that creating is not a solitary act, but communal. That beauty is born of collaboration, of different perspectives uniting in a common purpose." She turned to Fatima. "You reminded me of the pure passion that first brought me to art. Your dedication, even when you were afraid, gave me strength to continue. To Nasser, your silent presence and constant work were an anchor when everything seemed chaotic. You proved that loyalty and skill are as valuable as genius. To Amira, Aunt, you always knew this was not just about art, but about finding my place in the world. Your wisdom guided me when I was lost. To Rashid, Vizier, you could have been an obstacle. Instead, you chose to be a bridge. That required courage that I recognize and honor." And finally, she turned to Tariq. "And you," she said, her voice softening, "you challenged me in ways I never imagined. You forced me to grow, to question, to defend what I believe. But you also showed me that men can change, that power can be used to create, instead of control. We transformed each other, and that mutual transformation is woven into every tile of this panel. Tariq, rarely speechless, struggled for a moment before responding. "You entered my life like a storm," he said. "You destroyed illusions I didn't even know I had. You made me question everything about how I govern, how I live, who I am. It was uncomfortable and necessary, and I am grateful, more grateful than I can express." There was a comfortable silence as everyone absorbed the moment. Then Amira, ever practical, smiled. "Enough speeches. This old body needs tea and rest. But before I go, I want to say one thing." She looked between Layla and Tariq. "You have chosen a difficult path. There will be judgment, resistance, people who do not understand. But I have seen many couples in my long life, and I can say you have something rare. Do not let the world convince you to give it up." The official inauguration a week later was spectacular. Notables from across the peninsula attended, even from neighboring emirates and distant countries. The unveiling of the panel was choreographed to occur at sunset, when natural light would transform the colors into something almost supernatural. When the veils finally fell and the panel was fully revealed to the public for the first time, there was total silence. Not of disapproval, but of admiration. Even the most skeptical critics were speechless before the scale and beauty of the work. It was simultaneously traditional and revolutionary, reverent and bold, deeply rooted in Islamic heritage, yet pushing the boundaries of what sacred art could be. But there was tension too. Malik was present, obliged by protocol, his face a mask of courtesy that barely concealed resentment. Conservative factions looked with disapproval at Layla standing beside Tariq on the stage, positioned as an equal rather than a subordinate. Whispers circulated about the exact nature of their relationship, about whether this was undermining appropriate traditions. Tariq addressed the tensions directly in his speech. "I know some see change as a threat," he began, his voice firm but not defensive. "They understand that new ways of doing things challenge the comfortable and familiar. But I invite you to look at this panel, truly look. Do you see destruction of tradition, or do you see its evolution?" He gestured to the work. "Every technique here has been passed down through generations. The sacred geometry, the use of mineral colors, the infinite patience required. This is preservation. But the way it is applied, the stories it tells, the courage to combine ancient with new, this is growth. And growth is not betrayal. It is survival." His gaze swept the audience, pausing briefly on Malik. To govern is not just to preserve the past or blindly embrace the future. It is to find a way to honor both, to learn from tradition while creating space for innovation. Is it difficult? Yes. Does it cause discomfort? Certainly, but the alternative is stagnation, and stagnation is death. He turned to Layla, extending his hand for her to join him at the front of the stage. When she hesitated only a moment before accepting, he knew she understood the meaning. This was a public declaration, not just of artistic work, but of a partnership that challenged norms. Layla Al-Khoury taught me that true power is not in forcing obedience, but in inspiring excellence, Tariq said, his voice carrying emotion he did not try to hide. "She refused my arrogance and thus saved me from it. I am not a perfect man, nor a perfect leader, but I am trying to be better, and to have someone by my side who challenges me, who refuses to let me be less than I can be. That is not weakness. It is the greatest strength I have ever known." The response was mixed, as expected. Some applauded enthusiastically, especially the younger ones who saw in Tariq and Layla a model of a new kind of leadership and partnership. Others remained silent, disapproving, but not openly hostile, and a few, led by Malik, left the event early, their discontent obvious. But the majority remained, and when the event finally ended hours later, when the last guest had left and the palace had quieted, Layla and Tariq found themselves back in the hall, with the panel alone at last. "You know this won't be easy," Layla said, looking at the work they had created together, thinking of the life they would build in the same way. "There will be constant resistance, people trying to separate us, to force us into molds that don't fit." "I know," Tariq replied, standing behind her, his arms gently wrapping around her. "But I also know that anything worth having is never easy, and you are worth every challenge, every political battle, every disapproving glance we will face." Layla turned in his arms, looking up to meet his eyes. "Then let's make a pact," she said. "Never let them turn us into something we are not. I keep my workshop, my independence, my voice. You continue learning, growing, being the leader your people deserve, not what your father was. And together, we create something new, not perfect like this panel, but real and ours." "Agreed," Tariq said, sealing it with a kiss that contained all the promises words could never fully capture. In the months and years that followed, they kept those promises with fierce determination. Layla divided her time between Al-Sahara and Durra al-Fajr, her workshop prospering under royal protection but maintaining independence. She trained a new generation of artisans, created works that gained international recognition, always refusing to be defined solely as the Zeke's consort. Tariq implemented reforms that many considered radical: more governmental transparency, investment in culture and education, space for female voices in political decisions. He faced resistance, sometimes fierce, but remained steadfast. And when he doubted, when pressures threatened to push him back into old patterns, Layla was there to remind him of who he had chosen to be. They eventually married, but in a ceremony that reflected their own conditions. Not a harem, not submission, but a partnership of equals. It scandalized conservatives and inspired progressives, and they proved day after day that love does not have to diminish, it can amplify, that commitment does not have to be a prison. It can be mutually chosen liberation. The Zelige panel in the cultural center became a symbol not only of Durra al-Fajr, but of something greater, the possibility of honoring tradition while embracing change, of being rooted in the past while reaching for the future. People came from afar to see it and always left transformed, touched by beauty that spoke universal truths through the specific language of pattern and color. And on silent nights, when stars shone over the eternal desert, Tariq and Layla sometimes returned to the hall to look at the panel together. They saw not just a work of art, but a map of their journey. The chaos at the edges, representing their turbulent beginnings, the emerging order, symbolizing growing understanding. The radiant center capturing the love they had built, not despite their differences, but through them. It was not a fairy tale with a perfectly happy ending. It was something more real and more precious, a story of two imperfect people who chose to grow together, who transformed conflict into understanding, pride into humility, control into partnership. And in doing so, they created something that would last far beyond their lives, a legacy of art, love, and the courage to challenge what is in the name of what could be. Dear listeners, we hope this story has touched your heart. If you were moved, please like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what touched you the most. Every day we bring real stories, full of emotion and humanity. Your voice is part of this universe.